Sorry, interruption. I'm not going back and re-recording, so you'll have a weird 12-minute video at the beginning. So if you happen to open this first, you need to go back and watch the intro one. That kind of explains the build up to this. If you have already watched the intro one, then I was interrupted. That's why I'm recording now. So we have Archduke Franz Ferdinand going to Bosnia in order to spread goodwill, except of course the people in these kind of Balkans region are very resentful, and so you've got a number of nationalist groups. So the Black Hand actually will assassinate the Archduke. Of course, there's a whole story behind that. They publish his parade route. They try to throw bombs under his car, and they don't go off. And then, like the next day, he goes back. What I can't think of the guy's name. It's not Princip. It might be Princip. I think it is Princip. Goes back and basically shoots him at like point blank range, and this kind of triggers kind of payback from Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary that saw Serbia as being a protectorate, as kind of a place that they owned, feels like they should be able to go in and kind of slap Serbia around. Germany says, dude, we're your allies. We got your back. Russia tells Austria-Hungary, hey, don't pick on Serbia. They're kind of like our little brothers. We like them. They look like us. They sound like us. So we don't want you going in there and slapping them around. And Austria-Hungary says, well, then you better talk to Germany, because Germany's got something to say about that. And so then Germany basically tells Russia, hey, don't pick on Austria-Hungary for slapping around Serbia. So then Russia says, well, we've got France. So if you get mad at us, then we're going to call in our alliance with France. And then we're going to, then we'll be coming at you from both directions, right? Because remember, the map is such that you've got France on one side, Russia on the other. And so then what will happen is that Germany will say, fine, bring it. Germany and Austria-Hungary will go into Serbia. Russia will declare war on Germany. France will declare war on Germany. And so you'll have them beginning to kind of start this action, right? Now, Germany knows that they can't fight or they don't want to fight a two-front war. So their idea is to knock France out of the war as quickly as they possibly can. So what Germany will do is they will sweep through the Belgian territory and come into France and try to keep France from fighting, and then they can focus all their attention on Russia. Well, that's all well and good, except Great Britain said, hey, Belgium's like our little brother. So if you try to invade Belgium, if you try to go through Belgium, then we got something to say about it. Well, of course, Germany goes through Belgium. That means that Great Britain declares war. And next thing you know, Europe is all going crazy, right? So you end up with allies that are France, Russia, and Great Britain. Shortly, about a year or so later, Italy will join in. And the central powers will be Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. So this map does a pretty good job. This is why they're the central powers. France, kind of gives you an idea there. And again, Italy joins a little bit later. They're not the first ones involved. But this is essentially kind of the two groups that are fighting. And very quickly, Germany pushes into France. They start to kind of build a trench line on the eastern front towards Russia. And you end up with a two-front war that's based on largely defensive measures, right? Now, the trench will stop before you get to Paris. And this kind of tells you a little bit, what we're talking about. So you'll have a trench line that's over here to protect the German Empire. And then you'll have a trench line here where France is trying to hold their own with the help of Great Britain. And so the trench warfare, Belgium, of course, gets really kind of beaten up. The Germans are not always very well behaved in Belgium. Kind of upsets Woodrow Wilson. He's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they would, shell and throw all this ammunition at poor little Belgium. And you immediately have this trench line that's kind of a defensive conflict, right? Now, Wilson will proclaim American neutrality. He'll say, hey, we don't want to get involved in this. This is the Europe thing. But despite his neutrality, the U.S. is busy loaning lots of money to Great Britain. And of course, then eventually they're loaning lots of money to France, and they're loaning lots of money to Russia. And in addition, they start to help produce the goods and the materials that are needed. And then, of course, they're buying on credit the goods and materials that are needed to fight, So early on, American neutrality is such that while technically we're not fighting, we are providing the weapons of war. And pretty early, Britain will blockade Germany. So there'll be a blockade up here and there'll be a blockade down here. So it makes it very difficult for Germany to be able to get the supplies that it needs. And so what this means, it's not that the U.S. won't actually trade with Germany, but they can't really get the goods into Germany because what's happening is this blockade. So that's going to be a huge issue. So the U.S. tends to be more economically connected to the Allies as opposed to the Central Powers. You have lots of immigrants. Of course, the U.S. has that Anglo-Saxon kind of British heritage, and that tended to kind of connect people to that. And the German submarine warfare will kind of make German citizens a little less proud of being German, and so they'll kind of be like, and British propaganda will basically, make a lot of noise about how the United States, should do something about Germany, that they're committing all these atrocities. Other causes for the U.S. to enter submarine warfare. Now, there's a process to the submarine warfare. We tend to talk about it as though it was just the Lusitania and then bam, we were in the war. That's not how it shapes out. So the war starts in August, September 1914. The U.S., of course, is loaning money. We're sending supplies, 1914, 1915. And what will happen in 1915 is Germany's like telling the U.S., that's not very neutral behavior. You're not sending supplies to us. We don't like you sending supplies to Great Britain. So they start sinking ships, right? And they start going after ships that are bringing supplies. And of course, part of the problem is these U.S. businesses realize that if it's clearly a supply ship, it's going to get sunk. But if they put weapons on passenger ships, the Germans aren't supposed to sink passenger ships because they're supposed to be just people going back and forth and could have Americans, and Americans are neutral. So American businesses start using passenger ships and having secret manifests that have supplies on them, weapons, ammunition, all that kind of stuff. So what will happen in 1915 is Germany will basically sink the Lusitania, right? Now, Germany doesn't want the U.S. involved in the war, so they will issue an apology and say, oh, gee, we're so sorry, we'll never do it again, right? Then in 1916, similar situation, Germany issued a warning that says, hey, please stop sending materials, weapons, and stuff over on passenger ships. Please stop that. They sink a ship. They say, oh, gee, we're so sorry. We'll never do it again. And this is kind of this process. And understand that when Germany would be kind of issue that when Germany became aware of the passenger ships, they would typically post warnings. It wasn't like they did it on the sly. Like they would take out ads in American newspapers and say, hey, warning, we might sink your ship because y'all are sending weapons over on passenger ships. So it was pretty well publicized that when they would be doing this. So you have this back and forth between 1915 and 1916, where the U.S. continues to send ammunitions and shells and blankets and all that kind of stuff over to Great Britain. And Germany keeps saying, please stop that. That's not very neutral. Now, 1916 is an election year. Wilson makes a whole lot of noise about how we're not going to get involved. It's not our war. It's not our fight. He's going to keep us neutral. And he will win in 1916, largely on the basis of he kept us out of the war. But then going into 1917, right? Woodrow Wilson gives his 14-point speech where he talks about having peace without victory. We'll look at that in class, kind of this idea on how we should end the war. And clearly kind of states the U.S. might be interested in getting involved. Now, Wilson's probably talking about the peace process, but Germany clearly perceives this as we're going to have to end this thing, and we might as well, deal with the fact that the U.S. is a problem, right? Now, part of it too, by 1917, Germany is really the trench warfare is dragging on. It's kind of dragging Germany down. They're having trouble fighting. So they decide to risk the U.S. involvement. They resume unrestricted submarine warfare. They sink like 6 ships. This is the Lusitania right here. Um, and, they know that's going to upset the U.S., right? And so you have the unrestricted submarine warfare. That's a major cause. But you also have an attempted alliance with Mexico. So Germany knows that resuming unrestricted submarine warfare after the Sussex Pledge is likely to really upset the United States. So they want to hedge their bets, and they basically reach out to Mexico, who, remember, we've had some issues with Mexico because of the incursions and because you've had people coming into Mexico and that kind of thing, or the soldiers coming into Mexico. And so they reach out to Mexico through a diplomat, and they say, hey, if you join us and we win, then we'll give you back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, and you can take those back. So remember that little war you had in 1836 or 1846, 36. No, 36 is Texas independence. 46. We'll give you that territory back. Now, understand that in Germany's mind, they passed Alsace and Lorraine back all the time. So they don't see this as, from the German perspective, they don't see it as that big a deal. Obviously, they don't understand the Americans. And so the Americans are like, oh, no, you didn't, right? The British released this memo. We find out about it, and it just kind of pushes us over the edge, right? And so this telegram makes a huge difference. The U.S. will then, Wilson will then ask for a declaration of war on April 2nd, 1917. It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war. And so you can kind of read that there. We'll talk about his war message in class a little bit. We'll look at some of the things that he says. Prior to U.S. entrance into the war, you had basically a stalemate with Britain and France. You had the Central Powers. You had these trenches that barely moved, just a few inches either way. Lots of artillery, these big, shell guns, grenades, machine guns, airplanes spying on where the weak parts of the trench were, the earliest tanks to help people cross no man's land, poisonous gas, all that kind of stuff, right? So this creates this really horrific kind of battle, which we'll kind of go into in a little more detail eventually. And then the other concept here too is in 1917, Russia has a revolution. So if you think back to talking about imperialism, I think maybe I mentioned the Russo-Japanese War, how Japan in its rush to industrialize started to kind of want the Sakhalin Islands, and how Teddy Roosevelt negotiated a peace. And this is why he sends the Great White Fleet in. Well, this is the result from the Russian end. So the Russo-Japanese War and the failure, the fact that Japan kicked Russia's butt, creates a lot of instability in Russia. Now, there had been instability for some time. The Tsar was autocratic. It was a dysfunctional system at best. And so you'd had groups questioning things. But beginning in 1917, you have one wave of revolution in February, with kind of a democratic regime overthrowing the Tsar. But the democratic regime is intent on staying in the war. The Bolsheviks, the communists, they start saying, oh, we need to pull out. We need to pull out of this war. Germany intentionally brings Vladimir Lenin back into Russia just to help stir up trouble. And so in October, the Bolsheviks will take over, and they will negotiate the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which will pull the Russians out of World War I. And this will happen about the same time that U.S. troops are reaching a critical mass in Europe. So as Russia kind of fades out of the Allies, the U.S. will be there with fresh troops, fresh supplies, and all that kind of stuff. So this is kind of the origin of Russian communism. This will matter more later when we get to World War II and when we get to Stalin and we get to, the Red Scare and all that kind of stuff. So just kind of stick that in the back of your mind. One of the early problems that we have, of course, is having to raise an army. We create a Selective Service Act of 1917. This is a draft where people are assigned a number and they pull the numbers out of a thing. And so that way, instead of going to a county and saying, okay, county, you have to raise X number of men and people can pay their way out of it, everyone's assigned a number and it's meant to be more fair, more equitable, right? This classic progressive system of efficiency and fairness. So you see that with the Selective Service Act of 1917. And so you end up with a lot of men drafted. You do have some volunteers. A lot of them, lots of IQ testing, lots of progressive ideas that kind of come out of that, as far as kind of training people, that kind of thing. You do have Mexican Americans that fight in World War I. You do have African Americans, and we'll kind of be talking about that in more detail. African Americans and Mexican Americans and really any kind of ethnic group, right? Really sees this as a major way to kind of stake the claim to citizenship. We too are Americans, right? We deserve these equal rights. So if you put kind of African American service in World War I in the context of the lynching that, say, Ida B. Wells had talked about, it gives you a very different kind of perspective of the role of African Americans, and the debate about who should be a citizen. And when our country calls us to duty, what does that look like? Women will work with the military, not as an official part of the military, but as what they call an auxiliary corps. Think Rough Riders, a group of people that kind of serve with the military, but not as part of the military. And so they serve that particularly as nurses and radio operators. So raising the Army, the Doughboys, that's kind of a big deal. The famous "I Want You" for the U.S. Army poster. Lots of liberty and victory bonds to help pay for this. The war is expensive. They have to control wages. They have to control prices. They have to control supply. They have to control raw materials. Lots and lots and lots of government control of the economy. So one of the great ironies is that, Woodrow Wilson had run on this idea that, the economy should be free to function how it wants. But in reality, during World War I, that's not exactly how it plays out, right? In World War I, they have this very tightly controlled economy, much more like, Teddy Roosevelt's New Nationalism. You have the War Industries Board that coordinates production. Again, trying to raise Liberty loans. If you pay attention to this one, it has a bunch of ethnic names, kind of focusing on this idea of unity. You have a food administration that's ultimately led by Herbert Hoover, which we'll talk about when we get to the 1920s. He leads the food administration, talks about voluntary rationing. He would have meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, trying to get people to conserve and contribute to the war effort. So you have kind of this early kind of all-in mentality, right, where every ordinary person is trying to conserve, trying to grow their own gardens, trying to grow their own food, serving in the military, whatever capacity they can. You have lots of women taking factory jobs, doing that kind of thing. Fuel administration controls production and consumption of fuel. This is where you get the ideas of daylight savings time, for instance. The National War Labor Board controls labor unrest. Creates union recognition. So unions kind of gain a little bit during the war. That will change later on. Government contracts mean that companies are making a ton of money. And of course, women are working. So this helps institute an 8-hour workday. You'd already had the Adamson Act. Now you have women working. And so they start to make a lot of money. And women are doing things like making, artillery shells, for instance. And one of the ways in which companies try to make people happy in this war environment, because we don't want to have strikes, we don't want to have layoffs, right? We want to keep the workers happy so production's going, because these companies are making a ton of money for the war effort. So they rely on what is called welfare capitalism, that idea of benefit packages, that kind of thing. And so women work in these industries. Eventually they will go back kind of to more traditional roles. Eventually kind of go back. You will have kind of a new change about women after World War I. You'll have the new woman of the 1920s. And some of those women do work outside the home. You don't have quite the dramatic shift of kind of women and their roles that you'll see later in the 60s and 70s. But certainly women's contribution contributes to the argument for suffrage, which we'll go into in a little more detail. I may kind of do like a separate thing about that. Kind of to call attention to, because we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, and there's a good chance that might be in the STAR test a little bit. World War I's been in the STAR test quite a bit lately, the last couple of years, because we've been at this 100-year anniversary. First off, the U.S. entry into the war, the end of the war, that kind of thing. 1919, they may not have it as much, or they still may keep some of those questions. So that's why you need to be a little bit familiar with World War I. You also have a migration of African Americans. Part of this is that African Americans are joining the military, but part of it too is there's lots of good war jobs, and so the white males are off at war. You do have African Americans off at war, but whites are in a larger percentage. So it creates a vacuum, right, where workers, African Americans want to take jobs, so they move to the city. They're pretty fed up with lynching, so let's get away from that. So that's kind of what we have. That's kind of what we have going on. And so Mexican Americans with the Mexican Civil War, you'll have a lot of Mexican immigration coming up, taking agricultural jobs because African Americans are moving north because of migration. So you kind of have that vacuum effect. So a lot of Mexican Americans today can trace their family back to this early 20th century when you have that. So again, this will create some racial tension. So one of the ironies of World War I is that you have heightened racial tension, heightened racial conflicts, you have lynching, all that kind of stuff, because you have the movement of people. So you have housing pressures, you have job pressures, you have questions about, about democracy. If our guys are off fighting, shouldn't we, why should we be treated this way, right? So we'll see some of these trends happening as well after World War II, but certainly after World War I, this kind of moves a lot of African Americans to the north and will kind of create the foundation for the Harlem Renaissance. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to share a third part and kind of pick up with kind of the civil liberties to focus some attention on that.